say what lab, just says from a lab. And then the rest of us sort of assume China because that's what our politicians and media say, right? As the U.S. continues to use this lab leak theory to ramp up anti-China rhetoric, China hit back this week saying, you should look into your own labs. Now, recall that the Department of Energy recently came out with this report saying that they think that COVID could have come from a laboratory leak, and they said so with low confidence. Here was the breaking story at the end of February, I believe it was. Yeah. Here is the low confidence bit, that the Energy Department made its judgment with low confidence, according to people who have read the report. The FBI previously came to the conclusion that the pandemic was likely the result of a lab leak in 2021 with moderate confidence. Okay. Again, nowhere in the story does it say where that lab leak may have been. So, we all automatically just jump to China, right?
Right. It's Wuhan. Yeah, right.
So, but China now says that the U.S. has not been cooperative with investigations on the origins of COVID, even with the World Health Organization, which doesn't seem that interested. Now, this is the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Mao Ning. She accused the U.S. of political manipulation regarding the origins of COVID, and she pushed back on the World Health Organization's statement that China has not cooperated with COVID investigations. Instead, she said they have actually shared more data and research findings than any other country and contributed the most on origins tracing. So here's the statement that sent me on this down this rabbit hole today. She says the U.S., however, ignored these science-based conclusions and recommendations and kept pressuring the WHO into repeatedly demanding origins tracing in China. It's quite clear what the U.S. is trying to achieve. While claiming to take origins tracing seriously, the U.S. never invited WHO experts groups into the U.S. for a joint study or shared any early data. Instead, it has turned a blind eye to the world's concerns about U.S. biomilitary bases at Fort Detrick and around the world. And so, I was like, oh, what's that about? Fort Detrick. I hadn't heard of this lab before. I've heard of COVID labs in the U.S. and North Carolina. Those were mentioned in the Fauci hearings. We reported on COVID projects in Boston, where those were dated February 2020. So we know they were working on COVID, at least in Boston, before we all went into lockdown. But what is Fort Detrick? Well, I went digging. Here is sort of a comical tweet that was surfaced to me from our friend of the show, Garland Nixon. He says, breaking news, now CDC insiders consider that the agency is about to release a document saying that theory that COVID came from a Chinese lab is now perfectly acceptable, whereas once we weren't allowed to say that. However, any assertions that contain the word Fort Detrick will be considered QAnon conspiracy insanity. Okay. So we've all been warned. If you go down this rabbit hole, you're going to be called names. We're going to go together. Let's go. So there are biolabs in Maryland, and they have been subject to, or the question, are there biolabs in Maryland, and have they been subjected to COVID origin investigations? Those are the questions we should be asking. So there are, in fact, biolabs in Maryland, and it turns out that the Fort Detrick lab did have a lab leak in August of 2019. Here's the New York Times headline over it. This is an NIH lab, meaning a Fauci lab. Go ahead.
I was going to read it because people who listen to the show won't be able to read it. Deadly germ research is shut down at Army lab over safety concerns, says the New York Times.
Dated August 5th, 2019. This is Fort Detrick that was closed down after investigations in June and July, and then remained closed over a very mysterious period of time. Now, this lab, the history of this lab began in the 1950s as Camp Detrick. Wikipedia says that it was designated a permanent installation for peacetime biological research and development shortly after World War II, which I had to lol at. Peacetime biological research, huh? Mm-hmm. It did, in fact, make biological weapons until President Nixon ended that program and kicked that on over to the Department of Health and Human Services in the 1970s. So I guess biological weapons are considered Health and Human Services.
Oh, of course.
Okay. The website today has this COVID lab for Fort Detrick. It opened as a COVID lab in April of 2020. Before that, it had been closed for 8 months in the summer of 2019 after the CDC investigated it. Now, here was the at the time, military.com reported on this because it's a military biolab. This article since has been taken down. It only exists on web archive sites. So you see here that there were, in fact, breaches at this lab in the midsummer of 2019. Here is the summary from this article. The two breaches reported by these two agencies demonstrated a failure of the Army laboratory to implement and maintain containment procedures sufficient to contain select agents or toxins that were made by operations in biosafety level 3 and 4 laboratories, according to the report. Biosafety level 3 and 4 are the highest levels of containment requiring special protective equipment, airflow, and standard operating procedures. Due to the redactions of the report, due to redactions to protect against notification of the release of an agent under Federal Select Agent Program, it's unclear the result of the two breaches. So they don't exactly know what came out of it. And then this Colonel Darren Cox says, well, breach is a loaded word. You can say, he's like, while there was a breach, there was no exposure. He said no one was exposed to any agents or toxins. Just, I don't know. How does that land on you, Philip, as someone who's worked in labs?
So, yeah, I'm trying to parse this out. So if they're in since it's a virus, it's probably a VSL 3 or 4 lab. So that's virus security level or safety level. But so if there was a breach, but no one was exposed, a breach in a level 3 or 4 lab, a level 4 lab is required to be located in the middle of a level 3 lab. And it's all under negative pressure. So if there's a breach in it, everything gets sucked in, not out. So if it made it out of the level 4 into the level 3, and then there's some kind of breach from the level 3, that doesn't happen. That would, to me, would imply. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not working there, but to me, that sounds an awful lot like someone was exposed, because that's kind of how it.
Yeah.
Willis Addison worked there. He's one of our viewers. Willis, nice to see you tonight. Thank you for watching. Willis, thank you for his super chat. He said Fort Detrick is a level 4 military lab. I worked there.
Okay.
There you go.
And so the rest of this article goes on to say, like, well, we think someone put their foot in a door to stop it from closing while they were going in and out to like let in a friend. That's how it reads. And I'm like, they should have known better. So we closed the lab down for 8 months. It's very hard to buy that. I'm going to send you the full article I'll put it in the chat and you decide how you feel about that. But it does feel very much like, no, come on. But just before this breach, researchers from this lab were working on research about coronavirus. Look at this paper published March of 2019. I made a little video here so that I could hover over the authors' names so that you know that they are, in fact, Fort Detrick researchers. So we know now, here's a graphic from that paper predicting that these viruses, including coronaviruses, this is how they could spill over to humans. And here are the people who would be high risk. This is 1 year before the pandemic. The paper doesn't necessarily say they were experimenting with COVID, but they were studying it. I can't say whether or not they had actual samples, but we do know that they were studying it, and we do know that there was a lab leak in the summer of 2019 that caused the lab to be shut down. The same summer, during the lab closure, there was an outbreak of a respiratory virus in Virginia about 60 miles away. Now, we can't say they're related, but we are saying someone should look into it. And the doctor who ABC interviewed said, yeah, this is unusual. It's summertime. Listen.
Tonight, a deadly outbreak in Virginia, 2 deaths and dozens of residents sickened by a respiratory illness here at the Green Spring Retirement Community.
For a respiratory outbreak to occur in July would certainly not be as likely as for it to occur during the winter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do we have a respiratory outbreak in July? That's strange.
Others are saying, this thing was a someone in the chat was saying this place was an anthrax lab for 40 years. It's been sealed up for 40 years. So who knows what other nefarious things they've been working on there.
Okay. So did this mysterious outbreak at the nursing home just end, or did it quietly spread throughout the U.S.? Was it COVID related or another respiratory virus that also rages through the summer? Could have been coincidental, or perhaps there were case numbers suppressed in the U.S. before the pandemic really got started, as early as 2019 or 2020, even first day of 2020. In fact, USA Today and the Palm Beach Post found that in Florida, the state had removed records from its website showing that they had as many as 171 COVID cases on January 1st, 2020. They had positive cases on January 1st, 2020, which means those people had COVID in 2019. They didn't announce any COVID cases until March 2nd. Here is that story from the Palm Beach Post, which the USA Today also ran, saying, we know that COVID was here before they told us. Look at this last sentence. The state pulled the records off its website late Monday without explanation. So, an infectious disease lab was conveniently closed while COVID was just starting to break out for unrelated reasons. And then 8 months later, hey, everyone, we reopened and now we can work on that COVID thing that has come about since we've been closed. Here's the article about when they opened back up, saying, lawmakers applaud the decision to reopen Fort Detrick. So if this is all feeling conspiracy theory to you, I admit it feels all too coincidental, because while there was a lab leak in a lab that studied COVID, and then there were respiratory virus outbreaks, and then COVID was here before we knew it. And so what? I mean, this smells, right?
Yeah, it smells a lot. And as one of our YouTuber says, or one of our chat, Joel says, Nathan Rich did a whole breakdown of this. I'd forgotten about this. The Hot Pot King, he did a whole timeline of Fort Detrick and wondering, where did COVID-19 actually come from? So the narrative that we've been spun about this idea that it came from China, that it came from that spot, well, interesting. And we also know that, of course, at Boston University, they were doing gain-of-function research prior to this COVID outbreak. Right.
So here are all the things that play into this conspiracy that we know for sure. I just made notes because I'm like, this is too crazy. We do know that Fort Detrick researchers were studying COVID in early 2019. We do know they had a lab closure due to a breach in the summer of 2019 and didn't open again until April of 2020. We do know there were respiratory outbreaks in that region at the same time. And we do know that COVID was in the U.S. long before March of 2020. And we know that the U.S. has not participated in origin tracing in any U.S. biolabs. And for some reason, the World Health Organization doesn't seem all that interested in doing so. Now, the Washington Post says that the fact that we're even talking about Fort Detrick again, they're sort of saying it revives the claim. Here's the Washington Post today, that China angrily reacts to Wray's COVID, that's Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, COVID lab leak comments, reviving Fort Detrick claim. Not that old thing again. But nowhere in this story do they say why it's a conspiracy theory. They don't say it's been disproven. They don't even they just say once you start to hear it, no, that's just China's bringing that back up again. They just label it an old trope. It's new to me, though. So back to what Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Nao Ming said. She says that the U.S. has been politicizing origins tracing, and that only hampers science-based cooperation on the issue, disrupts united effort to combat the pandemic, and undermine global health governance mechanisms. We hope that